mic, I'll walk around.
All right. Yeah.
We have to wait for the person to introduce us.
We're from Lewis County, Washington.
Yeah, here, stand in front of here and say hello to Ed.
Not King County.
Here,
Hey,
lean over and say hi to Ed.
Oh. Hello.
If everybody could just say hi, Ed.
Hi, Ed.
Welcome to our presentation, Ed.
You feel betrayed?
That's gonna be like his text tone now. He'll take it. And
The hi, Ed text, yeah.
No.
We're gonna get started as, I don't know where our room monitor is.
Wasn't that the room monitor?
just got quiet in here.
It's so quiet.
We said we're gonna get started.
I thought you were. I'm not in charge. I don't get to make the decisions.
I'm close enough for it to pick up my audio, and I don't trust myself.
I hit hard. It's okay.
Here she comes. Is it on? Just move that a little bit so you don't have
Oh,
to.
it's my butt.
Yeah, there. Yeah, that's even better.
Hello. Oh, what is that recording?
Oh, just
Okay, I'm like, hello.
just us.
Can everybody hear me okay? This is going to be the volume somewhat they're going to have, so great. You can hear me in the back then? All right, last session of the day. Welcome. Glad you're here. We're glad to have the presenters here. Just a reminder, the QR code, please make sure that you scan it. I put them at different parts of the room. And then at the end, we would love your feedback. I'm sure they would love your feedback on the presentation.
Only if it's good.
Only if it's good. Processing grief, just to make sure you're in the correct room. If not, you're welcome to stay anyway. How's that? And, please silence your phones or turn them off, either one, for our presenters. Are we good?
We're good.
Okay, Lisa. Uh-huh.
I'm going to try not to use the mic. Everybody can hear me? Yeah. Perfect. I'm Brian Curtis. I'm with the Mechanicsburg Police Department. We are located just outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Any Michigan people? There we go. Any Michigan people in the room? We can use our hand too in Pennsylvania. So we're right here in the middle. We are 2 hours from Philadelphia and 3 hours from Pittsburgh. So basically right in the center of Pennsylvania. So I've been a police officer for 23 years with the police department. Obviously, it's one of those things, once you get involved with any kind of instruction, they pretty much throw everything at you. So I do a lot of our presentations and stuff. I teach in our local police academy. I'm a CIT coordinator, and I also am a CIT instructor. Another thing that my brother, and I'll kind of introduce you to him, Ed, he and I do a lot of implicit bias training for CIT classes in a bunch of different counties, and also try to get into the academy to talk about implicit bias as well. So there is 3 of us who are supposed to present, but Ed, who is my brother, he's my older brother, but he's been in law enforcement 2 years less. He has been in law enforcement for 21 years. He unfortunately got bit by something when he was at the beach on Sunday, went to urgent care, and they told him just take these antibiotics, you're good. Went back to urgent care, they circled a huge infection on his leg and said if it grows outside of this, come to the hospital. So he's actually been in the hospital since Friday. So he was not able to come out. We're hoping he can still keep the leg, but we're going to record for him on that side. I'm just kidding about that portion of it.
Although we did think about it.
Just kidding about that. He is improving vastly. They just keep kind of doing the trick in the morning. The doctor says, yeah, you're going to get out today. And then another doctor comes and says, oh, you're not getting out today. So it kind of keeps getting delayed, but he's definitely improving and stuff now. So Ed actually was a police officer for a number of years, and went back and got his social work, his master's in social work, and then became a therapist. So he's an LCSW and works with Lisa at Grief Relief. So I kind of joke with him. Anybody ever seen Spaceballs when you have the guy that barfs? He says, I'm a man's best friend. He's half dog, half. So Ed is his own co-responder. He's half police officer, half therapist. So what's really funny is when we go into rooms and we do presentations, depending on what she says first, like if he says I'm a therapist first, all the cops are like, are you kidding me? And he's like, oh, I'm a cop. And the therapist is like, you're a what? You know, so they're always kind of fighting back and forth. So
Yeah, and I'm Lisa. I own Grief Relief, where we do grief and trauma work. So I have been a social worker. I graduated in 2003. I worked at our local hospital at the Penn State Hershey Med Center in their adult partial hospitalization program. So I did a lot of that for about 22 years. I was at the med center for about 22 years. I know I barely look that old. But and I was a former first responder. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a volunteer firefighter and EMT. My claim to fame is that I was at the Camp Hill prison riots. People have heard about it. I know. Thank you. That's the best response I've gotten for that. Yeah. Yeah, we stood around the perimeter, right? That was our job, stand around the perimeter. And they said, if you hear the word, what word do you think they said if you hear what word? You guys that are in law enforcement, people that are in law enforcement. What would they say if we had to run? Scatter. So there you are, standing in bunker pants and jacket and stuff, and they're like, so if they breach that fence, and you hear the word scatter, run like hell. So fortunately they didn't do that, but anyway. So so I have my own practice. We do grief and trauma work, and one of the programs we have is a first responders assistance program, which means that any first responder in the county that we live in gets free therapy if they need it beyond CISM and peer support. So they get up to 10 sessions. So I've been working with a lot of first responders over the last 2 years with that. So that being said, you have to be careful in Indianapolis. Why? Let me tell you. So we get here Saturday. Brian has to go to a conference or a training for a whole day. So I said, I am going to be the tourist of the year, right? And so I said, I go out front and I said, how do I get to the Speedway? He says, yeah, you know what happened? 2 blocks up, and on the right, you can't miss it. So where did I end up? I ended up at the Speedway. So I'm like, oh, that was I don't think he meant to be a joke, but anyway, I did find the Indianapolis Speedway, next slide. And yes, in case you were wondering, I did kiss the brakes. 100% worth the trip. So let's get into it. What is grief? So when you think about grief, so I'm going to do some overview here about just grief. So we're all on the same page about what grief is and what it entails. And then Brian is going to talk. Oh, I'm sorry. I know. I'm used to presenting with Ed.
Is he the favorite?
He's got him, yeah. So this is the big, long definition of it from the American Psychiatric Association, right? So the big thing about this is it includes distress. Some level of distress, grief always includes, and it happens in all of the areas of our lives. It's a physical, right? You have physical responses, cognitive, behavioral, what other ones? Emotional, and spiritual. So you have, grief doesn't just happen as a mood, right? It's just not, oh, I'm sad. No, I'm going to withdraw. I'm not going to talk to people. I'm going to not exercise. I'm going to eat terribly, which is perfect for me. I'm going to eat terribly, and maybe I'll stay in bed for a while, right? So we kind of have those, that's our default when we're feeling like really, really sad. And that's a appropriate and common response to grief. But then I found this quote. I guess I shouldn't stand in front of that. It makes it easier. So I found this quote. Grief is when something happens to you that you didn't want to happen, right? You didn't want that person to die. You didn't want to not get that promotion. Or when something doesn't happen that you wanted to happen. Oh, I really wanted to go on that trip. Or I really wanted to have this great marriage. And then it doesn't happen. Right, so we grieve that in our own ways and in different times. There's no time frame. Often there's those stages of grief don't work very well. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Oh, go back one. So I had a patient that I was working with. I call them patients, clients. He talked about sorrow, and he had experienced sexual abuse when he was a kid, when he was in 5th and 6th grade, and so he ended up writing a song about it. And it was just like this sort of gloomy song, right? And I said, well, that's what it sounds like. What does it look like? He said, it's purple, it's blue, and it's dark. So I showed him that picture. He says, that's it. That's what it looks like. So for him, grief had a sound, right? It sounded like the music he wrote. It also looked like dark and a little bit like messy. So that's that. Okay. What is unresolved grief? So many of us walk around with unresolved grief. We don't even know it, right? That happened to me. I didn't know it. So I had a grandmother type figure that died when I was in my 20s. And I didn't know what to do with it, right? She died. As a kid, we never went to funerals. My parents protected us from that. So I'm in my 20s and Barb dies. I'm like, what do I do with this? What is this feeling? What is this pain? What is this awful, awful stuff that I feel? And I finally talked to somebody and they said, oh, you have unresolved grief. And I was, thank God, because this is terrible. So if it has a name, right, it helps. So we talk about, in clinicians, we talk about, do we label people? And labeling ain't great. Like, you don't want to have a label, right? Because if you carry a gun, you don't want to have a PTSD label. But on the other hand, when somebody said I had unresolved grief, I was relieved because I thought, well, if there's something that we can talk, if it has a name, then maybe we can fix it. So that's kind of how I got into this work, because somebody helped me get through that, and now I get to help other people do that, which is kind of cool. So here's what happens. Unresolved grief, it sits in the front of our brain, right? And the volume is turned way up. And this is the same for trauma. Anything that's not resolved sits in the front of our brain with the volume turned up. And what does that mean? It demands our attention, right? It demands our attention. It's right here in our face. And as we process it, as it moves from the front of our brain to the back, and I'm not a brain specialist, so this is more ed stuff. So I'm just telling you what I know. As you process it, it moves to the back, and the volume gets turned down, meaning it doesn't have the charge, and you're not sitting in it quite as much as you were in the beginning. So if you look at that radio, in the beginning you got that loud wavelength, right? And then as you move through, there's shifts. I call them grief shifts. And as we shift through some of the grief, the volume gets turned down. And for some people that happens in a couple months, but for some people it takes years. I've had 2 people come to my office, actually it's been 3, 7 years post loss, and all 3 were suicides or overdose. 7 years. And they were all men that took that. It just takes, it takes something to push somebody. Usually it's somebody saying you need help. But sometimes, it just takes time for you to realize that something is not working. And sometimes it takes a long time. Okay. So, Kairos moments. Somebody explained this to me one time, and I love this. Grief is like you're sitting at a stoplight. It turns green, and everybody goes but you. Right? Kairos time. So what's our time is Chronos, right? We go by, oh my gosh, it's 10 after, I gotta talk faster, right? But Kairos is like this space and time that doesn't really, it doesn't go by our Chronos time. It's just like, it's this sort of almost holy space in a way. We talk about Kairos in terms of the Bible sometimes. But that's it. I love that. You're sitting at a light, everybody goes but you. Everybody goes but you. So let's just talk about a few definitions of the types of grief that we might experience. Ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is when something or someone profoundly changes or disappears. Think about somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's, right? They're physically here, but they're not emotionally available. And I also, you think of like the Natalie Holloway cases where she's not physically here, and they're still trying, she's emotionally, there's still that connection. And we still always have that connection, but so that's ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss writes a lot about that. Cumulative loss, suffering a new loss before you have a chance to grieve the first loss, or suffering multiple losses in succession. That's the one we see the most, and that's where this comes in. So one of the first people I worked with in the First Responders Assistance Program, his original trauma, he was a career firefighter, his original trauma was that his dad died when he was 12 years old. He became a career firefighter, and he went on calls after call after call. So dad's death, right, original trauma, and all of those other traumas attached themselves to it. Think about it. When you go to a wedding, what do you reflect on usually? Your own, right? You think about your own wedding. You kind of relive it. When you go to a funeral, what happens? You relive and revisit other losses. And we don't even realize that we're doing it. And they were like, oh man, I remember going to so-and-so's funeral, I remember this funeral. And so I say cumulative grief accumulates. Right, it's cumulative grief. And that's what first responders deal with, is cumulative trauma and cumulative grief. And so it's like we got to peel that onion back and figure out where everything started. And then we can address it. And then anticipatory grief, grieving a potential loss before it occurs. Do maybe some of us worry about, like, retirement is the end game, but not everybody looks forward to that, right? So do we grieve the loss of our career or role before it happens? Like when your kids, if you have kids and they go to college, are you grieving them leaving the house? Kind of thing, right? Yeah, no, you're like, screw that, get out of here. If I see you at Thanksgiving, we'll be good. But it happens, like we don't realize that we're grieving necessarily because we don't put those words to it. But that's basically what it is. Right? And sometimes we grieve things that others can't understand. Disenfranchised grief, Kenneth Doka. Go ahead. So he started doing research about the grief that people don't recognize. And this started back when AIDS became more prevalent and people were dying from AIDS. And what were the people saying? Well, you weren't, they were looking at it as if a same-sex partner died, they said, well, you weren't married, so you don't have the right to grieve. People, everybody has the right to grieve. Let me tell you, let me give you permission right here and now. Everybody has the right to grieve, and don't compare your grief to somebody else. Because I used to do a lot of speaking with a woman who lost both of her children. Her ex-husband murdered them on Christmas Day. Right. She's an amazing person. It's been 30 years. She's an amazing person. However, when we would speak, what happened in the audience? Everybody would say, well, my loss wasn't that bad. Well, my loss wasn't that. She lost both her kids at the same time on Christmas Day. My loss wasn't that bad. Yes, it was. You get to have the feelings you have. You get to grieve whatever you need to grieve, and nobody gets to judge that. And that's what this is all about. You don't get to judge what other people grieve. But disenfranchised grief is unsupported, unacknowledged, unvalidated, and unrecognized by people. And that's what Brian, he's going to talk about some of the things that we grieve over the course of a career as a first responder. We'll get to that, so pretty soon. So sometimes the loss is unspeakable, unacceptable, people don't relate to it, or it's unremarkable, minimizing losses. It was just a pet. No, it wasn't. And you know what? I can listen to any story. People tell me any story. I cannot listen to stories about pets. Why is that? I don't know. It's just like that's where it stops for me. And somebody was telling me they lost like 3 horses in the last year. I'm like, oh shit. And then they're telling, did you know? I didn't know this. This is free. This is just a free stuff that I got. They bury them in manure. They bury the horse in manure, and then it becomes compost. I'm like, what the hell? Okay, I guess we're not having a funeral for the horse. And then they get the bones later. I don't know, but anyway, I just found out about that. I share it with you. Okay, go ahead.
Well, we all know what we're gonna take away.
Yeah, they bury horses in manure. All right, let me tell you this before Brian speaks. There isn't any experience in life more common than loss. Correct? Yes. I have an answer for you. And I'm going to prove it. So here's what I want you to do. Everybody, take 2 seconds. Think of someone or something that you've lost. Something that you miss, someone or something. Doesn't matter. One, and it only needs to be one word. Because first responders are great at telling stories with one word. If I say one word, if I say riots, right? Now you know all about that. Oh, I was in the bunker gear, I was in the field, they're going to tell me to scatter, blah, 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 right? So everybody think of one person or place or thing that you've lost, and on a count of 3, we're going to say them all out loud together, okay? So you get ready? You ready? Because I have one. You got one?
Yep.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3, barn. So now those stories are not hidden anymore. right? The story's not hidden, and we just honored whatever that thing is that you lost, whatever that person, that place, or thing. This is one way we honor it. My friend Lynn, that I told you about, she loves to hear stories about her kids, Jen and Dave. So whenever somebody says their name, she's like, what are you going to tell me? And so that's what, if you can find people to tell your stories to, it's amazing, the power of a story and the power of how many people will relate to you, right? There's a lot of people that will relate to loss because it's the most common experience in life. So, and then asking how long grief is going to take is the same as asking us how far is up. Because it could take forever. Remember those guys that came in 7 years later, right? So that's a little bit about grief in and of itself. And here's what I wanted. So we talk about distress. Oh my gosh, I have a typo in there. So that's supposed to stay huge. Yeah. So the way we think about grief is, and trauma both, are how much distress do they cause us? Like, I might have something happen to me and I might say, yeah, I'm okay. You might have something happen to you and they, oh no, that sucked, right? Same event, but we have different responses because of our lived experience, our past, and also like however we relate to the event. So let's say we have a hinge distress. We have hinge distress. That's a class 1 response, right? Class 1 is high distress. This has really got me, and I got to figure out what to do with this, right? I need help now. Then we have class 2 response, which means what? I need help, but don't rush. Maybe use a little light and siren, but you don't have to rush. And then class 3 response is the low distress. So, okay, just kind of get here when you get here and we'll talk, right? So those are kind of the ways to look at how much distress do you have about an incident. Is it a class 1, 2, or 3 response? And we were talking about mental health scale from -10 to +10 in one or the other, John Reed. And I was thinking, oh, that's kind of makes sense in there. And then we talk about the stages of grief. And in terms of stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross writes about them. Bless you and bless you. But what happens is, Kubler-Ross, these stages were written for people with terminal illness, right? So they don't necessarily apply to the after loss. And somebody said that there's nothing to bargain with. When you lose something, there's nothing to bargain with. So you're left with basically with anxiety. Instead of bargaining, you don't have any bargaining power when something's gone, but you end up with anxiety. And so we know what that feels like, and we know how that feels. So Kubler-Ross, grief is nonlinear, which she kind of says there. And there's really the stages. We think there's the event that happens, there's the work that you do to try to make meaning out of it, to try to resolve it, and then there's forever. Meaning, grief doesn't necessarily, closure's a myth, but the volume gets turned down, and you get reminded then of it. Make sense? Makes sense, okay. So this is really what it probably looks like. This is the reality of grief, right? Makes more sense, okay. And so when you look at the shifts of grief, remember I talked about the shifts of grief? So here we go, we have high distress here. And whatever we're dealing with controls and consumes our lives, right? Volume turned way up. As we move through it, again, there's no closure up here, but we also have things that impact us then, right? It impacts us, but we're not sitting in it. Then maybe it influences our behavior. So when you think about it, our past experiences, write this down, our past experiences influence our present reactions and behavior. You got it, right? Right. So as we move up through here, a STUG, sudden temporary upsurge of grief. It's a reminder. I don't know, the sensory person. Like we smell something, we hear something, we see something, hear a song, right? Smell burning, something burning, and it may take us to a really scary place, a bad place. And so up here you have, the distress isn't as high, so lower distress. So we kind of move through this and grief shifts over. And, what do we grieve? We grieve when anything we value, a loved one, our health, our job, or expected future, is suddenly maybe taken away from us, or when we face a sudden change, something that we don't have time to prepare for. And then we're like, where do I land? And now I will turn it over to Brian.
So how many people have experienced any of this stuff up here? Right? At some point in time, we all have. It doesn't matter when we started our careers. And a lot of times when we start early, we have that look of like, this is going to be the best job ever, right? If you've ever gotten into any kind of career, when you first step into it, especially in law enforcement, you come home and you tell your loved one about everything that you did that day. Everything. Oh, we got into a crash? Oh, and then we went to this other thing? Oh, and then we went to this ambulance call? And then we did this? And then what? About 6 months into it, what do you tell them? Right. What happened to work today? Not a whole lot. You know? So when we think about this, you think about all this loss as it shifts through your career, and then we start looking at that grief and all that trauma that kind of stacks on top of each other, and then we look at suicide numbers. And suicide numbers are where? 26 to 40? Do we think this might have something to do with it? What's sometimes happening in that law enforcement side of things? We're looking towards what? Retirement. Loss of who we are, right? You're starting to look at a loss of maybe a relationship. I've been there. Right? Your kids are moving out, or maybe things happen that, things just aren't going well. You didn't get that promotion that you thought you were going to get. You weren't where you thought you were going to be. Has anybody ever thought about that? I didn't think I was going to be here at this age. I didn't think I was going to be doing this stuff, right? And you're realizing the time's kind of running short, and it's all that grief that just keeps kind of stacking on top of everything. So obviously when you start the job, and especially when it comes to first responders, and when it comes to the mental health, and it comes to clinicians, right? What are you going to do? I'm changing everybody. I'm going to fix everybody's problems, right? So I got into probation. That's where I started, juvenile probation. I was a juvenile probation officer for 2 years. When I went in, every kid was going to start to comply, and there was going to be no repeat offenders because I was the man. Right? After 2 years, I said to myself, dear Lord, can you please just give me one? Right? Well, when you're at the academy and they teach you these things, you're going to go in and fix everything. I go to that domestic, fix that shit, right? I go to that mental health call, fix that person. And what are we really doing sometimes? Putting Band-Aids on festering wounds, right? Just telling somebody, hey, why don't you go to 2 different rooms and don't talk to each other? Oh, that's a great fix, right? Well, you fix it for about 15 minutes until they have to come back out, right? Well, I took that mental health person to the hospital. They're going to get help. And then you see on the street 2 days later, what do they say? Oh, I was gone in 45 minutes. And they didn't help me at all, right? So you think about these kinds of things, you're thinking you're going to be able to fix it. So then when you go home, you can fix that shit too, right? How many of us have been in that situation? Don't talk to me like that. Don't talk to me like a therapist. Don't talk to me like a cop. I'm not somebody on the street, right? Because we start to get into that idea that we're going to fix everything. So my wife just recently got her therapy. She's doing therapy now too. And you know what she likes to do now? How'd that make you feel? No. I know that's your question. I'm not answering that one, right? Ask another one, okay? But when we think about that, and then those first exposures to trauma where we thought, I fixed this, and then we go back and we find out that we didn't, right? Or that person that we thought we had stabilized unfortunately does the unthinkable that we didn't want to happen, right? And where do we go? We look at ourselves. We look at ourselves and we start taking that blame on. And then, how many people have ever gotten to their houses? You just don't got it today. And you're looking at that front door and you say to yourself, you know what? I just don't want to go inside. Because I was terrible at work today, and that means I'm going to be terrible what? In the house, because I don't feel like dealing with it. So we're just kind of keep compounding that grief. Missing birthdays, holidays, and sports is something huge, right? So as I went through my career, I've been married for 22 years. 20 years to my first wife, 2 to my second. Screw up the first one, thought, why not do it again, right? Missing birthdays and holidays and sports was just something that happened. It was kind of known about, right? But do they still ask you to take off? Yes. And you have to say to your loved one, listen, I really want to be there, but I just can't. And what's it sound like to them? You don't want to. Because in my house growing up, can't meant won't. Right? So unfortunately, we just kind of put it into our thought process. I used to have to say to my ex-wife, please don't ask me 3 times, because the second and third time hurts me as much as it's hurting you that I'm not going to be able to be there, right? So I tried to do everything that I could to be there for my children, especially when it came to sports. I would sleep in the stands. I would sleep in the car in the parking lots just because I wanted to be present. Now, I sometimes say to people, there's a difference between being there and being present too, right? So sometimes I was there, but I really wasn't. And I had to kind of work through that as I kind of went back through and did my own therapy to kind of figure some things out. You know, working during the bad weather, the chaos, you know. With social media now, especially when it comes to first responders, if something bad happens, what are people doing? Right to Facebook. We had to tell our dispatchers, do not put, so sorry for the loss that this department had today. Because a lot of times that's unfortunately how the loved ones find out, and then they're going, what? Oh shit, was that my loved one? And then they're trying to call. Can we answer the phone at that point in time? No, so now they're thinking the worst, right? Not wanting to talk to family, that's a huge thing, right? We also, obviously, we try not to. We do a lot of protection in regards to that, when no matter what career we're in, because listen, the stuff that we have is just bad stuff, right? And don't you love the question when you meet people and they find out your job? That had happened to me last night. Tell me the worst story that's ever happened to me. I'd be more than happy to talk about my trauma. And in fact, I'd like to relive it right now. What kind of question is that, you know? So usually what I will say to people now is, I'll tell you what, I can't think of the worst one that's happened because I've had a lot, but let me tell you a funny one. You know, let's move past that. So at least then I can kind of basically save face and not say, be rude. What you really want to say is, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to traumatize myself in front of you today, right now. So when we think about promotions and special assignments and things that you kind of go through the career, and you don't get that assignment, what do you say? I didn't want it anyway. Right? Yeah, exactly. My brother, before he went to promotion, he's like, I'm going to be a slick sleeve my whole career because I don't want to be promoted. I was like, you know who people that say that are? People that aren't motivated to work hard. But then when you don't get it, it's everybody else's fault, but whose? Yours, right? But it's still that grief. How do politics play a role in anything that you do? Woo, right? In law enforcement, we don't wear the vest for the people on the street. Right? We wear the vest for the people in the halls, okay? You know, when you think about some of these things, you have a lot of politics that are there, but again, when we start blaming those other things, are we processing our grief the way that we should be? You are allowed to say to somebody, you know what, I'm really pissed off and I'm disappointed that I didn't get that promotion or I didn't get that assignment, and then you can move on from there. Because what are the people that are saying that got the assignment? They're feeling bad for you, but they don't know how to approach it. Right? Have you ever gotten an assignment over somebody or a promotion over somebody and you don't know how to talk to that person that was in line with you? Right? So obviously internal investigations, they're always wonderful. City of Philadelphia used to have a policy that said you couldn't shoot into cars. Has anybody ever read news in Philadelphia City? They shoot into cars a lot. So what would happen was they'd get an award. Nice job, you saved the world, you saved everybody. Here is your commendation for doing such a great job. And then what they get on the backside? You violated policy. Here's your hit. Right?
We had 2 suicides for them.
Yeah. You know, a lot of problems in regards to those kinds of things. And we're always kind of doing that. Well, I didn't do anything wrong. Why am I getting this hit, right? Why am I getting it? Because I actually thought that I did the right thing. And you tell me I have discretion, but now you're saying that I don't because I did the wrong thing. You know? Sometimes that's hard stuff. An internal investigation, if anybody has ever been in part of any kind of internal investigation, you know, they usually say, what? We got your back. You'll have protection through the union, right? He laughs. You know, it's bad. And God forbid you get sued. God forbid you get sued. Because now you're the defendant. And then they tell you the bad stuff. The greatest part is whenever they tell you, we know you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't violate policy. You're not in trouble, but we're going to pay it out. Yep, we're going to pay it out. What's that say to you? Exactly what you're hearing. Yeah, I didn't do anything wrong, but if you're paying it out, then I feel like I did, right? So again, some of that grief and that anxiety. So obviously, when you get that promotion or you get that assignment, doesn't that friend group kind of shrink down? Right? So as I got promoted from patrol to sergeant, a little less friends. As I get patrol to sergeant to lieutenant, a little less friends. Now when you're walking in the rooms, what's happening? Conversations end. And you're like, gee, I wonder what you were talking about. Probably, you know, me, right? And you can't get to know some of the people on that same level either, right? We got younger guys in there that I know a little bit about, but I don't know as much as I do some of the older guys because it's a different relationship. Is that okay? Absolutely, but you got to recognize it. You got to recognize that it's just not going to be that way anymore. And God forbid you get promoted over a friend. I had somebody who was a friend of mine that I was then supervising, and he said to me, I thought we were friends when I dinged him, right? So I said, well, you got 2 options here. We can continue to be friends, and I continue to be your supervisor, or I can continue to be your supervisor. You make that decision. Right? I can separate. If you can't, then we're just not friends anymore. Does that suck? Absolutely. So obviously not being able to do the same job as you kind of promote up, as you kind of do things, and you're kind of delegating, right? That's kind of a hard thing to do for probably everyone in the room. It's that kind of type A personality. They want to have that control. There was a officer in Lebanon. They got promoted to sergeant. They had an active shooter call him out. He grabbed his vest, grabbed his gun, was getting ready to go out the door. The lieutenant says, "Where are you going?" Did you hear that call? He's like, "Yeah, you're a sergeant. Your job's not to do that anymore." And he sat down. What are you feeling like that? Helpless, right? I can't go out and do what I used to do, what I know how to do because of that promotion that's up there. And then sometimes we miss just not having that much responsibility, right? Sometimes as you promote up, your responsibility becomes more because you got over top of it, but your workflow isn't as much as it used to be. Retirement. It's a big one, right? How many people have somebody within their agency, wherever it is, that they just need to go? Right? It's time and it's past time. Here's a hint. If you're sitting in here and you can't think who that person is, sorry. I don't mean to offend you. There are some people that just hang on way too long, and I have a chief regard to that. People always say, well, don't make it your identity and all that kind of stuff. Here's the bad part about it. People know who you are, right? People know what you do, right? So although you don't want to make it your identity, everybody else does. But you have to have a plan. You have to have a plan. You have to know that 25 and 50 is the end day, and we want to make that plan to enjoy retirement. Police officers, they say once they retire, the average lifespan is like, 3 to 4 years after retirement? Listen, I've worked long enough. I'm not going to only collect 3 or 4 pension checks, or 3 or 4 years worth. I want to collect a lot more than that. But that's also making sure that we're putting our ducks in a row for family too, right? We don't want to retire alone. We have to make sure we're checking in on that side of things. Retirement, obviously, again, one of those, who am I now? Losing relationships, purpose, those kinds of things. If you're somewhere and you're kind of telling people what you did 10 years ago, you should be telling people what you were doing like 5 years ago, 3 years ago, right? Because if you're saying, well, 10 years ago I used to do this, that means within the last 10 years, what the hell have you been doing, right? The stories that you kind of tell and the things that you're doing, you got to be careful about that. And serving others. But here's the thing. We serve others all the time, but who else should we also be serving? Ourselves, right? Is that a hard thing to do? I had a detective that started with me, and he said, I missed a lot of birthdays, and I missed a lot of family vacations, and I missed a lot of stuff. And guess what? I'm never getting back all that. He said, if there's something I can tell you, make sure that you make what you can with your kids and your family. So now we have the new generation coming out. What do we bitch about them? They don't like being at work. Wait a minute. We're telling ourselves that we should check out and take care of ourselves, and now we're seeing the newer generation coming up, and what are we doing about it? Complaining. Well, they never want to be at work. What? I kind of look at it as like that's kind of a good thing, right? They're not maybe picking up the overtimes because they are at home. In some ways, I look at it as I'm kind of a little jealous that they have that opportunity and that knowledge to do it now rather than waiting till she says to you what? You better get help now or I'm leaving. Because that's when we all of a sudden are like, oh, you know what? This family thing's kind of important to me. When it's too late at that point in time. So obviously holding space is a big thing. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to kind of talk about that, finish things out.
Okay, don't get seasick.
Yep, I know.
All right, so here we go. Holding space. I love this concept. When we sit with somebody, no matter who you're sitting with, no matter who you are, you can hold space for people and their grief and their trauma, right? So the human spirit, we want to be witnessed. Our stories need to be witnessed, right? Because we want people to acknowledge our losses. So the human soul doesn't want to be advised, fixed, or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, to be seen, heard, and companioned exactly as it is. There's a quote, listening is hard, do it anyway, right? Don't open your damn mouth. And here's the thing. Don't one-up somebody. If somebody's telling you a story, don't tell them, oh, I heard somebody I know that they went through that and it was a terrible outcome, right? Don't tell them something that's going to turn out crappy, right? And don't try to one-up somebody. Oh, well, that's nothing. Here's what happened to me, right? That happens. Why? Mostly because we're uncomfortable and we don't know what to say to people in the midst of their grief. Here's a hint. Don't say anything. Just listen, right? When we make that kind of deep bow to the soul of a suffering person, Our respect reinforces the soul's healing resources. We have it within us. We have it within us. Sometimes we just need to tap into it. The only resources that can help the sufferer make it through. And we've talked about that, about the resources in different presentations. But what if we're somebody's resource? Right? What if we're somebody's resource? And all we have to do is listen. We don't have to fix anything. Right? That's not our job. Our job is to listen, acknowledge, and validate. So what do we know about loss and grief? This is just sort of a summation of my work so far. Loss is permanent. Somebody's not coming back, right? That car that you totaled, gone, right? That car you totaled's gone. Grief is a response to a permanent loss, right? We're human. It's a human response to a loss. And it's what happens. We feel it. Grief is permeable. This is important. Grief is permeable, meaning light can come through. Grief is dark. If grief is darkness, that purple and red, right? It's permeable though. Light can get through. We just have to find out where it's coming from and how to turn on that switch, right? You just have to find out where that switch is. We can grieve the past, present, and the future, or maybe all at the same time. Grief can be death or non-death related, and that's what Brian we were kind of focusing on the non-death related losses, because we don't think about grieving death or non-death related losses, we think about grieving death. And not all grief is recognized, validated, and supported, as I said earlier. So those are some of the things that I've learned just in a couple of years that I've had my own practice. So, how do you deal with people in grief? Yikes, right? Crying turns up that volume another level. Like I used to do work for Women's Health, and there was the postpartum. The postpartum moms would be in there, and somebody in the office. They would have somebody in the office, and they call over. They say, so, "I have a new mom in the office, and she's crying. What do I do? Do you have tissues? Tissues would be good, right?" And I said, "Well, what do you want me to do? You know, I'm here. You're there. You're with them. Do they need to go to the emergency room?" "Well, no." "Well, let's see. You have a prescription pad. I don't." Like, I could see them, but maybe give them a little something, take the edge off, and then send them over here. But crying, people crying in your presence, right, it's uncomfortable. It's not for me, because I see it all the time. Because how many clinicians do that? Right, does crying bother you anymore? No. Yeah, it's like, they'll get over it. They'll come around. So crying is, it's a natural response. Like, it's a good thing to cry. So, and they teach us in school, right? They teach in school. Don't shove tissues at people when they're crying, because why? Quit crying already. Here, take this. Quit crying. You quit crying. And you quit crying. We're not crying now, right? They tell you. That's what they tell you. Don't. And I worked with a therapist that did that. Somebody would start to cry, and he'd be like, he'd be looking in the room. Where's the tissues? Where's the tissues? Here, quit. So if somebody's crying, just listen. Just listen. Don't say anything. If you don't know what to say nothing. Yeah.
Can we ask them if they want tissues?
Yes. Can I get, like, if there's snot coming everywhere, like I've had people in my office with snot, and I'm like, you don't get a tissue. It could be like Oprah. You get a tissue, and you get a tissue, and you get a tissue, and you get a car.
It's the silent slide.
Yeah, the silent slide, yeah. Like, oh, here you go.
That's what we don't want.
Yeah. It's tough. I feel terrible for people who are crying. It sound like I didn't. I hate when people cry. I feel bad because you know they're in pain. But then again, I sit there thinking, but I know what to do. Like, I know what to do. So it's okay. But there's my favorite story about people crying is an officer that I worked with, and he had a lot of problems with alcohol, and he was kind of like over it. And I had seen him kind of when he hit rock bottom, because he ended up having no treatment. He ended up being off work for a little while. But I had to go do a debriefing for that department, and a SISM debriefing. And he was there, and it was a suicide call. And they were all talking about, what did you experience? What did you do? What blah, blah, blah. And we came to him, and he said, and it was a woman, and her husband had taken his life. And he said, she was crying, and I didn't know what to do, so I just held her hands. And I was like, I went up, I was like, I love you. I was so proud of him. I'm like, that is amazing. Good for you. You didn't say anything. I didn't know what to do, so I held her hands. And that was like, I was like, what a great moment. What a great moment and he didn't think it was anything great, but I thought, wow, what a great response. Loved it. All right. So here's the cliches. Remember I said, don't say anything? You've all heard these, right? What's the cliches that you hear that people say when somebody loses something?
I know how you feel.
I know how you feel. I know exactly how you feel. They're in a much better place. Yeah, that's a good one. What other ones? What's that? Oh, be strong. Yeah. God won't give you any more than you can handle. It could be worse. Oh, it could be much worse. Oh, at least you have another child. What? So here's my favorite one. I had a friend, and she went to the viewing for a friend of hers from work, and their 5-year-old son had died from a brain tumor. And she's in, you know how you are, you're in line, right? And does this happen to anybody else? You think you see him breathing? Have you ever done, you look in there and you're like, I don't like to look, but I think I see him breathing. And I'm like, shit, if they sit up, I'm out of here. So she's in line, and she's getting to her coworker, right? And she's a sympathetic, empathetic person, right? So she walks up, and what comes out of her mouth? Good luck. and I tell that story all the time. She goes, I don't know why that happened. I was thinking what you're thinking, like, oh, I'm here if you need me, call me if you need anything. By the way, people are not going to call you. Because you know why? People have a very short attention span for other people's grief. How many people have come into my office and said, nobody talks about or remembers my loved one? And I always tell them, people have a short attention span for your grief. So it's almost up to the grievers to bring up something, because people don't want to bring it up because, I might upset somebody. I might have to cry. I might have to get out my tissues, right? So good luck. So she felt terrible. She loves that I keep bringing that story up. I said, Michelle, I tell that story all the time. She's like, oh, I'm glad I gave it to you, but So there's things that under pressure we say and we don't mean to. So those are things. Cliches suck. All right.
I just want to speak to this cliches about you can always get married again.
It's not your turn.
I know. I'm going to take over.
Go ahead.
This one, going through a divorce, when I went through my divorce, I used to kind of look at divorces like back pain. Like someone says, I threw my back out, and you're like, oh, is it really that bad? Blah, 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 blah. And then you throw your back out, and you're like, damn, this sucks, right? Divorce kind of that same way. And you say all of those things like, oh, you'll get over it, oh, it's fine. And the great is when, my wife has done some things, when they say, oh, well, she deserves everything she gets, right? It's like, well, still who? Still the mother of my kids, still my wife, so there's still those things there. But what was I saying to people when I was going, when I was going through it beforehand, right before I had that? The same things that now people are saying to me, and I'm going, man, that's the dumbest thing I ever said to anybody, because it doesn't help you at all, right? And some of that grief, especially going through, was what I was finding is people just don't understand what it's like, and it's tough, but it's different for each person, right? And my brother gave me the wisdom, my twin, and he said, just one day you're going to wake up and you're going to be good. But I don't know when it's going to be. I'm like, well, that sucks. That's great advice, but tell me when it's going to be, because I want to know that, right? Lisa was kind of talking about that, and it took a while, but one day I just woke up and I'm like, I'm done. I'm done grieving. I'm done dealing with this, and it's time to move on. It's time to get going again.
Okay, exactly. Swim, float, or tread. The point is not, and never will be, to stop grief, because we cannot stop grief. That's like trying to stop the ocean. The point is to find ways to swim. Find our ways to swim. And sometimes we might need a life jacket for that, right? And sometimes that life jacket might be somebody that we know, might be somebody that we don't know. Like it might be somebody that that just pops into your life. Have you ever had this happen? Somebody that just pops into your life at the right time? It's amazing when that happens, like synchronicity or what, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's God moments, kairos, I don't know, but it works, right? It works. People show up sometimes when we least expect it and we don't even know. I had a patient once, had a terrible day. I was having a terrible day at work. I got in a fight with a colleague. I was right. Just so clear. I had a patient show up. She had an appointment that day, an outpatient, and she came in and she said, I can't stay. My car barely made it here, but I needed to tell you this. I need to tell you you're in the right place and you're doing the right thing. And I started to cry. I'm like, what? She says, and I gotta go. How did that freaking happen? How did she walk into my office on the exact day, know what was happening, that I needed to hear those words? I did need to hear those words. How did she do that? Right? How do we come in the side? How do we hold space for other people that are going through a bad day or the worst day that they've ever lived? Right? How do we hold space?
We just did that last night for a colleague where it was just, we just sat outside by the night. Yeah.
You listen.
And it was weird because there were other things that, like somebody texted him like right after we had the conversation. And it was like, this morning we checked in on him, but it was like, we gotta look out for each other.
Great.
How many times have you had that where you say to somebody, hey, how are you doing today? And then they just like vomit,
Oh, yeah.
just to talk, blah, 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 blah. And then they're like, hey, thanks a lot. And they're like,
Okay, you're welcome.
cool, I didn't do shit, but all right,
Yeah, I had a fire. He was a dispatcher. Dispatcher and a volunteer firefighter came in, and he was like, just started rattling off calls. This is personal stuff, professional stuff, volunteer stuff, and then he left. He says, God, I feel better. Okay. That'll be $120. of which I will see 20. But anyway, so yeah, it's interesting, like how we can be present for people, and and we don't need to be trained. We don't need to be trained to be present. We just need to be good human beings, not sucky human beings. All right. So here's the thing we came up with. Salve, right? So here is your formula. This is your formula for how to support somebody who is going through grief and is telling you how bad it is. First, you support them. You're like, okay, let's sit and talk, right? So you sit, and how do you sit sometimes? Like they've done studies about how people sit. Like, do we come alongside? Do we sit face to face? They've done studies about it, right? Me sitting beside you, may be a little more intimidating, but it's also more personal, right? So we do that. We acknowledge the loss. And all we have to say is, it sucks, right? It sucks. 2 words. It sucks. I'm sorry this is happening to you, right? It sucks. I'm sorry. Listening, like I said, it's hard. It's hard sometimes not to want to put our stuff out there, right? But there's a time and a place, and you got to know when the time and place is, and don't try to outdo somebody. That's the whole thing. Don't try to outdo somebody else's stuff. Validate, like, that makes sense. And here's my favorite line. You can steal this. It makes sense that you feel that way. So anybody that I've worked with probably knows that. We have 10 minutes left. Anybody that knows me, I use that all. It makes sense that you feel that way. Right? Easy response. You can use that. And empathize. Yeah, I get it. This sucks. I get it. So support, salve. You put the salve. Support, acknowledge, listen, validate, empathize. Not hard to do, and you don't need any training to do it. Yeah.
One thing, I always I like to say thank you for sharing.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
Sometimes, like,
Sort of validating.
they've been holding that,
Yeah.
and you're giving it to somebody else, and it's like, thank you for trusting me with that information.
Yeah. Or I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's
Because
perfect.
it takes courage sometimes, I think, to even just consider it and then say it out loud.
Right. It is. Yeah.
It's
something that my officers always tell me is if they're on a job and someone vents to them, they're almost surprised.
Mhm.
So that is something that my officers always say, like, thank you for sharing.
Thanks for sharing that.
with
Yeah.
me, because
That
a
makes
lot of
sense.
times, especially in Philly, like no one's gonna talk to officers and
Yeah.
sit there and vent to them.
Right. Thanks
So
for
I think-
sharing. Where's my cheesesteak?
Exactly. Hey.
No, you're right. Thank you. I mean, that never hurts, right?
Right.
But what? I'm sorry. The hardest thing to say. I'm sorry. Thank you, and Worcestershire sauce. Right. That is hard to say. Believe. How many Ted Lasso fans?
Yeah.
Yes. Roy Kent. Yes. Roy Kent. What's that?
Bloody hell.
Bloody hell. And the other word, his famous word. What's his famous word? Go ahead. Everybody say his famous word together. 1, 2, 3. Roy Kent. I love that show. So here we go. Human beings are never going to be perfect, Roy. The best we can do is to keep asking for help and accepting it when you can. This is for everybody. First responder, clinician, administration, anybody. And if you keep doing that, you'll be moving towards better.
That was a great episode too.
Yeah, I know. I love that. I love the whole series. Except for the one show, it was kind of stupid.
Yeah.
The one where the guy went off,
Oh, yeah.
went off on his own. It's kind of weird. But that was, if you're going to watch it, you can skip that one. But anyway, so Ted Lasso, yeah, human beings, we're not perfect, but I love this. If we keep asking for help and accepting it, that's the thing, when we can. So important to be able to ask. And so hard. What's the hardest thing that people say when they come into my office? What was the hardest thing for them to do?
Call.
Make the phone call. And then after they make the phone call, then they're anxious until they get in the office. And then they're anxious until I tell them, it's okay. Until we say, you're fine. I got you. I got you. Okay?
So I'm going to share a text with you that I got today for our last slide, which is just thoughts and questions. But
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to read it to you. Just got it today. Have to say, when I first went to the hospital, I couldn't believe this was happening right now at all times. When they had held me there for antibiotics, I really got irritated that I had to stay. I even talked to my doc and said, can't you just let me go after treatment so I can be on my way? She said no. That really bummed me out, and I let people know that here. At this point, I realized this wasn't just my year to attend and present, but there will be other opportunities to present in the future. It has been a roller coaster of emotions, but I've learned a lot. I came from my brother today, and Lisa and I kind of went there and were like, damn, grief, anything?
Yeah.
Grief, anyone? So even he kind of recognized it, and I said, hey, I'm going to read this to them today just to put your bid on it. But, we've all kind of been there, that disappointment side of things, and we all know. And, Lisa talked about, letting people know things, and people always wonder, well, when do I send that text? When do I make that phone call? Something that somebody told me one time that was great advice. Usually we say, I'm going to text that person, I want to call them today. And then days, get busy, and it's the next day, and like, oh, I didn't get to it today, well, I'll do it tomorrow. And then all of a sudden it's 2 weeks, then it's 2 months, right? Well, someone shared a story with me one time that they called somebody and they said, hey, I just wanted to check on you today. And they said, I don't know why I called that day. It had been 3 months since the last time I had talked to him, but I just thought, I'm just going to make that phone call. And the person said, I'm not doing too well. In fact, I just had a gun in my mouth. And I put the phone down to answer your call. So send that text, make that phone call, no matter how long it's been, because like Lisa said, people always just want to have the validation of the grief that maybe they're going through. And just saying, hey, how are you? And a lot of times, remember, when you ask, how are you, don't be like, just saying, just be nice, right? Because if they start spilling, you don't want to be like, oh shit, I got to be somewhere, right? But I'll tell people a lot of times on the job, how you doing? And they'll be like, oh, I'm fine. No. How are you actually doing, right? Follow it up.
You good? I got that on my, you good?
Yeah.
You good? Yes.
I just wanted to say, what you were talking about early on about the loss of a perceived future, I think is so important to remember because it really underlies every single loss, whether it's a divorce, a miscarriage, the death of a loved one.
You're right.
All of a sudden, your future is different than what you expect, and it's hard to wrap your head around that.
For sure.
How many people have ever had the thought, I didn't think this was what I was getting into? I didn't think this was what it was going to be
All
all
these
about,
people that
right?
are leaving, that's
Yeah.
good. I didn't think this is what I'm getting into. I'm out of here.
So yeah.
Bye.
To your point, absolutely, absolutely.
Bye. Yeah.
My best friend passed away a couple weeks ago, and my mom is getting ready to be 96, and she says anything, she's a handful. Anyway, I took her to the funeral because Susan was like a second daughter to her.
Aw.
She walked up and she said, I think she made that.
See, our minds play tricks on us with that stuff. I'm telling you. If she did, we're all in trouble. Yeah. So, sudden temporary upsurges of grief. And the example that will help you remember that is a snow globe. Think about a snow globe, and all the glitter is settled on the bottom. You shake it up, and what happens? Swirling all around, right? And then you turn it back over, settles down, and that's it. That's the swirling is the sub, and then it'll settle down. Sudden temporary upsurges of grief. Teresa Rando is the person that she does complicated.
Thank you all. We'll be here for a couple minutes to hang out.
Wave dead.
Yeah.
Oh, we were going to take a selfie.
Oh, that's right.
All right, here, hang on. Stop.